Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give an opportunity for folks to trickle in here. We'll get started in just a few moments. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We'll just give it a few more minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Influencing the Inside Game, Policy and Advocacy on State Budgets and Appropriations. We're still waiting for a few more people to join, but my name is Joshua Harris. I am the Senior Manager of Marketing and Communications for the National Collaborative for Infants and Toddlers, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. And so while we wait for folks to trickle in, I'd like to ask you all as kind of an icebreaker to take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat. Put your name, the organization that you're with, and the city that you're based in, so that we have an idea of kind of who's here and who's joining us today. That would be greatly appreciated. A bit of a roll call to see what states are represented here this afternoon. And just a bit of a housekeeping items. We're going to ask that everyone remains on mute to reduce distractions throughout the presentation. We're going to have opportunity for questions towards the end of the presentations. At that point, I'll ask you all to use the raise your hand function and come off mute. I'll call on the questions in order. I'll be able to see who has a question there. You can also, though, feel free to post your questions in the chat throughout the conversation. Members of our team will be monitoring the chat, and we're going to collect them, and we'll go back and we'll get to them if someone doesn't respond directly in the chat to you. With that said, we may not have time to answer every question, but know that we're going to be documenting and keeping a record for it for future use. And also know that tools like this, this is a part of a series around appropriations advocacy, are meant to be a resource for you, and they're developed based on real life requests that we get from advocates on the ground doing this work and what their needs are. So if there's something that comes out of this where you would like a more in-depth or follow-up presentation, we are here and available to assist you. Or if there's a presentation that you would like to see as an addition to this, feel free to reach out to us. I'll post my email address in the chat so that you can email me, and we are constantly trying to figure out how we can develop the best tools for our advocates on the ground. Now, before we dive in with our excellent lineup of speakers, we're going to set a little bit of the stage on what's going to happen over the next hour. Today, we're joined by some experts who are going to guide us through the intricacies of state budgets, appropriations, ask, and fiscal strategies for effective engagement with state agencies and state legislatures, which can sometimes be complex, very nuanced, and difficult to navigate if you've never done it before. To engage in appropriations advocacy, it's critical that we understand the state budget process and timeline so that your advocacy campaign can leverage key moments required to spark the change that you're ultimately advocating for. You also need to understand where to find the information that you need to be successful and how and when to use it. While lobbying on appropriation is very similar to lobbying on a specific policy, there are key differences when engaging in the budget and appropriations process. And our speakers today are going to talk about the opportunities and the pitfalls that you absolutely want to avoid. Now, know that deciphering a state budget and navigating appropriations channels can feel overwhelming. And it is something that comes with practice. You get better with it. So the first time you do it, it's going to be very difficult and stressful. And then each time you get better and better. So we're eager to learn from people with the expertise in the field to hear what's worked and what hasn't worked. As a part of the appropriations advocacy training series rollout, we've already discussed why budgets matter. And today we'll focus on what advocates need to know to navigate the complex process successfully. So with that, I'm excited to begin with introducing our speakers. And so I'd love to turn it over to our first speaker, Whitney Tucker, who's the Director of State and Fiscal Policy Research at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Her background includes an analysis and advocacy on a variety of policies from child care affordability to Medicaid access and beyond. Whitney, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Josh. So you all, as I understand it, have already had a good grounding in why state budgets matter. So I'm going to skip right on through that and get into the thick of it today. So next slide, please. We're going to cover a lot of ground in about 7 minutes. So I will be speaking a little bit fast, but please, as we go along, write down questions that you have. We're going to have time for Q&A after everyone has presented today. So I look forward to figuring out what questions you have for me. Let's get started. So first things first, in speaking a little bit about some of the key features of state budgets, it's important to know that while each state has to create a budget, the process to get there can differ a lot from place to place, which creates a pretty idiosyncratic web for advocates to navigate, right? That said, these 4 basic features are something that you should be aware of in every state. So first off is the fiscal calendar. Unlike Congress, most state legislatures don't meet year-round. Most start early in the year with the primary responsibility of getting a budget written before the new fiscal year begins. And in 46 states, that's on July 1st. Some exceptions are in New York, where the fiscal year starts April 1st, in Texas, where it starts on September 1st, in Alabama, Michigan, and here in DC, where the fiscal year actually begins on October 1st. But exactly when the legislative session starts and the length of your state's legislative session will vary, from state to state. So I've included some resources on the last page of my presentation where you can find out more information about the exact situation in your state in case you are starting from a completely blank page and don't have any of this sort of background information yet. Also, before I get too deep into this, I just realized I didn't actually introduce myself or any of the work that I do. Sorry. So I'm Director of State Fiscal Policy Research at the Center, and my team really works to help advocates on the ground in states to push priorities at the state level that encourage policy that is more equitable, more fair, not just driven in a way that is benefiting people who earn the most, people who look a certain way, people who have a certain immigration status or background, and try to really make states think more abundantly about how to raise and spend the money that they have. So I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A as well. All right, second requirement here, getting back to budgets, is the requirement of a balanced budget. A big difference between states and the federal budget is that states have to have enough revenues, so money coming in every year to cover all of their spending. This is the phrase that you've probably heard, balancing the budget, right? What that means in practice is that adequate tax revenues are really crucial to supporting state services that you might want to see for different groups that you support. Right? So when states cut taxes, that money is not going to some other priority. And so there is always a need to think about how things are going to be paid for, and if a payment source is going to be cut, if that is necessary even for equity, thinking about why that happened and how you want to fill in that spending. A third function that is really important is rainy day funds. States can put money in reserve in order to minimize the impact of disruptions that might happen, like natural disasters or economic downturns or COVID-19. And that makes rainy day funds really important for sound financial management. But a thing you'll want to keep an eye out for is how much money your state is putting into their rainy day fund, because we saw during the pandemic that some states tended to hoard a lot of funds in those rainy day funds so that they would get to levels that were, historic highs for how much money states were sort of sitting on. And in the meantime, there would be all kinds of needs that people had at the state level that weren't being funded because states would say that they didn't have the money, they didn't have the revenues from, taxes and other sources. So that's something to keep an eye on. And then the fourth is just some major buckets of budget funds that are relevant in your state. So most state budgets usually include a general fund to cover basic state functions, Special state funds that might be devoted to some specific purpose or paid for by a specific revenue source, and that revenue can only go into that specific source for. And then the third is just a federal fund that helps support specific state services. Because over half of state expenditures actually come from states' own funds, but the remainder of them come from federal funds. So you'll see this with things like unemployment insurance, where it is paid for by employer taxes, but it is a federal project that is administered by the states. And so that can get a little bit more complicated. So it really does depend a little bit about what your priority is as to where you want to look in your state's budget to see what's happening with the money there and what might be able to be moved around. Next slide, please. So looking a little bit into how a state budget is created, the timeline for that. A state budget is passed every year or every other year in some states, states that have a 2-year or biennial budget. And that budget process occurs during most states' legislative session, which typically begins in January. The budget process starts when the governor issues a proposed budget. In a few states, this happens before the start of the legislative session, but in most of them, it happens after January. And usually the governor will give a state of the state speech and release their budget at the same time in order to represent those priorities. That budget then goes on to the legislature, which has the responsibility of passing the final budget that will actually be implemented. And so it varies by state how much power the legislature has in determining the final budget compared to the governor. Sometimes the legislature will completely ignore the governor's budget. In other states, the legislature is actually bound to follow the governor's budget. And so again, that resource page that I have at the end of this presentation will lead you to something from a group called NASBO that can lay this out for you in your state and tell you kind of what's what and who really holds the power at this point. But the budget that the legislature creates, in states with legislative flexibility, is over the next few months sort of reviewed and modified by different lawmakers, and they address the things that are in the governor's budget, in most states, and then also add additional tax and spending measures as they see fit. And then all states allow the public to weigh in on the budget with their priorities along the way in some form. This is an increasing problem in states, honestly, as there have been a lot of crackdowns on transparency that started, beyond the pandemic or earlier than the pandemic, but really got worse during COVID-19 as states could say that a lot of things weren't being done because they were difficult to implement under the lockdown restrictions, and then they just haven't been brought back. So things like, televised hearings for bills, accessible rooms that can accommodate more people, longer timelines for budget review, things that just kind of never came back and that states have kind of let slip is something that you want to keep an eye on in your state, because it can have really big implications for what priorities you need to get into your state budget, and also the democracy around that decision making and who's able to weigh in. Next slide, please. So work to get your priorities incorporated into a state budget is actually a lot easier and more effective when you start with a strong base of allies. Most of you are already advocates. You know that this is true generally, right? When you were trying to solve a problem, that it helps to have some friends. But it's best to start state level budget work by finding out who, if anyone, is already working in your priority area and talk to partner organizations. You're going to really want to ensure that your efforts are coordinated and that your work and messaging isn't counterproductive to the aims of your allies before you get started. And then beyond advocacy organizations, you'll also want to hear from state agencies before diving in really deep with your budget advocacy. In the summer, it's a good practice to reach out to state agency representatives and ask them about their priority areas and what they're requesting to go into the governor's budget. You'll be on stronger footing at that point to then advocate with the governor's office to shape the governor's budget before it is unveiled in the next year. Once the governor's budget drops, it's important to just kind of first go through and highlight the things that you like. Identify the priorities that you want to advocate for, including any that you feel are historically underfunded or often overlooked. And then in most states, there is a date by which bills have to be drafted and lined up for review. So before that date, you want to develop a relationship with a champion legislator. They are the one who is going to actually deal with legislative counsel in your state to actually draft a bill for your priority investment. So you'll want to work together to lay out the framework for what you want to see, how much it might cost, where you think that money could come from. And then in the first period of legislative session, January through March-ish, there are usually a lot of bills dropping besides the budget bill, and conversation about those bills that have hearings and committee debate. So when legislative hearings begin, you can start lining up people to testify with the help of your really strong coalition, and then get in touch with the committee chairs of relevant committees to understand the path to passage for your bill. So next slide, please. So after all that advocacy, where do we get the money for state budget priorities? Like, where does it come from? The main source of state revenue is state taxes, which consist primarily of personal income taxes and general sales taxes. States also collect smaller amounts of revenue from corporate income taxes and some selective sales taxes on items like motor fuel, tobacco, and then there are also statewide property taxes, although in most states, the property tax is only levied by local governments. So in addition to taxes, states also raise revenue through fees. So things like the fee to get your driver's license, fines for violating state laws, and then charges for services like park entrance fees, lottery fees, and then other sources like that. But we could talk more about that later. Those are typically a much smaller share of state revenue than personal income tax revenue and general sales tax revenue. Next slide, please. As you're looking at that, though, and thinking about where you might be able to pull money in budget debate to cover your priorities, it's important to know that the vast majority of state and local tax systems are really inequitable and upside down, which means that they are taking a much greater share of income from low and middle income families than they are from wealthy families. The absence of a progressive personal income tax, so progressive meaning that it requires people with higher incomes to pay more, and an over-reliance on consumption taxes like sales taxes makes this problem worse in many states, because things like sales taxes are paid by everyone the same, right? And a progressive personal income tax actually charges more from people who can afford to pay more. States that are often commended as low tax are often very high tax for people with low and middle incomes, who pay a higher effective state and local tax rate than people who earn much more money than them. So in 10 states, Washington, Texas, Florida, South Dakota, Nevada, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Oklahoma, and Wyoming, the tax systems are particularly regressive, with systems that ask much more of those who have the least. So these states that our partners at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, you might have heard it as ITAP, they call them the terrible 10 because they are states that tax their poorest residents, so those in the bottom 20% of the income scale, at rates that are up to 6 times higher than the wealthy. Middle income families in these states also pay a rate up to 4 times higher as a share of their income than the wealthiest families in those states. Next slide. And then the over-reliance on taxes that particularly burden the poorest residents also is designed into state tax systems. It is a feature, it's not a bug. What you see here on the screen is a screenshot of a report that we put out at the Center on Budget that lays into some of the history of these really regressive policies in many states and what we can do to push back against them. So I would just encourage you to read it and to consider the way that your pay for your budget priority is really prioritizing low and moderate income families, and considering the ways that wealthier families that have more privilege in your state might be able to shoulder a little bit more of that tax burden than the lower income families. Next slide. So now you're probably wondering, considering how inequitable most state tax systems are, how states actually tend to distribute the money that they raise, right? By far, the largest areas of state spending on average are education, both K-12 and higher ed, and healthcare. As a share of state spending, education has generally remained pretty constant over the last decade, but states also fund a wide variety of other services, including transportation, corrections, pensions, health benefits, assistance to low-income families, economic development, environmental projects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can see a lot of these things in this chart. The share of state budgets that's devoted to Medicaid has grown over time, while the share devoted to corrections and transportation has fluctuated a lot more, and the share for cash assistance to low-income families has declined by a lot. The specific mix of spending varies from state to state, depending on factors like how the state and its localities share funding responsibilities for public services, and how much state policymakers choose to invest in healthcare and education in other areas that people tell them that they care about. In some cases, that variation can be really significant. So, for example, South Dakota spends about 17% of its state budget on K through 12 education, while Vermont spends nearly 48%. And similarly, Medicaid makes up less than 10% of the state budget of Wyoming, but 27% in Missouri. So next slide. A huge feature in trying to figure out how to make that mix work for the people that you advocate for in your day-to-day work is the transparency in your state budget process. It is a really important factor in how state budgets are formed and ultimately passed, and in which of the priorities that I laid out in that last slide make it into a final spending package. In many states, even lawmakers are largely shut out of the process of determining a final state budget, leaving even less room for advocates to voice, concerns, interests, and priorities, right? So public engagement and transparency are really critical to any advocacy push that you have in your budget process to ensure that funds are spent in a way that meets community priorities and actually addresses the greatest harms. Oklahoma's multi-billion-dollar budget process is a really great example of what's going wrong in a lot of states right now. It is largely conducted in secret, negotiated among a few lawmakers and high-ranking government officials, and then sent to the rest of the legislature, which typically has a few days, sometimes a few hours, to approve on really important bills. Their process typically comes down to just 6 decision makers. And so rather than just focus on trying to influence those decision makers, I really encourage you all to call attention to the lack of transparency as you might find it in your state budget processes, and to try and encourage lawmakers to open up that decision making to a broader group. And then final slide. These are the key resources that I told you that I was going to share. These are really a high-level starting point. I think other speakers are going to get into some other tools that I think will be very helpful to you all. But to get started, if you have not engaged in your state's budget process before, I encourage you to reach out to your state's member of the State Priorities Partnership. It is a network of state budget and advocacy organizations that the Center on Budget coordinates, and they are in 42 different states. I am going to send out a PDF of these slides, and so you will have links here to look for these groups, but there's likely an SPP group in your state that could give you a rundown on your state's specific budget process, and also could really help to connect you with other advocates who might be working on similar priorities. And then the next thing is the National Association of State Budget Officers, NASBO, that I mentioned earlier. I've linked 2 things that I think are especially useful for y'all. One is a summary of proposed and enacted budgets in each state, so you don't have to search through your state's website to find the proposed budget. And the second is a report that they put out every year on budget processes in the states and the territories. And it lays out all kinds of things, like what I was talking about earlier, as far as whose budget really has more power, the governor or the legislature, your state's reporting timelines, when bills need to be filed, when the legislative session starts and ends. All of that will be in that report. And then the third is just guides from the Alliance for Justice, which has state-by-state, really practical, easy to read, easy to understand guides for nonprofit organizations to support you in lobbying efforts, so that if you choose to lobby, you know how to do it in a way that is legal and that is within the guidelines that are specific to your state. So that is all I have for now, and I look forward to questions later on.
Thank you so much, Whitney. And I see questions coming in the chat, so feel free to continue to post your questions. We're collecting them. Whitney's not going to go anywhere. She's going to come back for our question and answer at the end of this. But her team at the Center for Budget and Policy Priority compiles some phenomenal resources for people looking to understand more about state budgets and appropriations work. So we look at their site, explore, and use the tools that they've developed and resources. All right, next, we're going to hear a case study from Jacob Vigil, the Deputy Policy Director at New Mexico Voices for Children. Jacob's work focuses on anti-poverty initiatives, including economic security, safety net, and early care and education policies, which he does through research, statewide outreach, and advocacy. Jacob has deep expertise in helping advocates to learn more about the budget and appropriations process. Jacob, thank you so much for being here with us. I will pass the floor over to you.
Thank you, Joshua, and thank you, Whitney, and everyone for being here. I feel like I'm in the right place. Everything you said, Whitney, you really set the stage, and I hope what I can contribute is a specific state work that we do here that really fits everything that you've talked about in terms of what does it look like to do budget advocacy. Proud to call ourselves at Voices for Children the State Priorities Partnership Organization for New Mexico. And you referenced ITEP and their work. We are proud that New Mexico was the most improved state in tax equity over the last couple of years. And that's in large part due to some of what I'll talk about today and really that grassroots movement to improve tax credits and tax equity for people in our state. So yeah, I was asked to talk about how do we define an ask that's rooted in the state's fiscal realities and ambitious enough to spark change. So what I want to talk about in New Mexico, and a lot of you might have heard of this, but we had a tremendous decade-long effort to get an additional percentage from our state's land grant permanent fund withdrawn to be able to use for early childhood care and education, right? So that would require a constitutional amendment voted on by the voters. But first, the legislation had to pass to get that to the voters. That was a years-long effort. It really built the power and assembled a really powerful and diverse coalition that worked on that and got that additional funding, right? And we're talking about a permanent, long-term source of funding that was not a tax and that would be a part of our state's now early childhood care and education department, which was established during that decade, right? And was a big impetus for getting that legislation passed. So, we got it done in 2022. The ballot initiative passed with 70% of the vote. And we also had an early childhood trust fund, which was passed through legislation. So we have these two huge permanent and protected funds that was strictly for early childhood care and education. And so what I want to talk about is what did it look like for once that was done, that coalition did not stop, right? It really became about continuing that work and transitioning it to be about budget work because we knew that even though those funds were established and they would start flowing resources into our early childhood care and education, the legislature still had to appropriate those funds. The executive had to still designate where they wanted those different funds to be spent. And we wanted to make sure that in the budget and appropriations process, that those decisions reflected the will of the voters, the will of our communities and our grassroots partners that we worked with for all those years to get this money for our kids, right? So the ask after the 22 election was that the legislature would keep the trust funds protected, don't open them up for other non-early childhood uses, and use those funds and general funds, which we were in a surplus. We've been in huge budget surpluses over the last couple of years because of oil and gas revenue. Use that to maintain the 400% eligibility that we have for childcare subsidy and to increase provider wages, right? So those were our main asks. And we had the numbers. Like our coalition contracted with an economist to do a cost study for what a wage and career ladder would look like. And beyond that, though, we really leveraged our budget expertise and everything that Whitney spoke about. That's what we had been doing for years, right? And so we aligned our ask with the values and the pronouncements of what our early childhood secretary had already said were her priorities. So that also helps, right, that we have a relationship with her. We've cultivated the relationship with the executive and the agency. But again, we track the state budget regularly, the legislative, the executive, and even before, when the agency is putting their budget together, we're talking with the secretary so we know what she's going to ask for. We can be negotiating with her even before she puts in her budget request to say, hey, we want the wage and career ladder in here. Here's what it's going to cost. Can you commit to putting that ask in your executive budget? We follow the Legislative Finance Committee. We attend every hearing. We understand and follow how they make decisions, right? There's certain analysts that there's certain sort of principles that guide their analysis, right? So we kind of know what is that legislative budget going to look like. And so we're anticipating that. We're ready for where those sort of lines will fall even before the legislative session begins, when they have to start reconciling that budget, right? And then even bigger picture, we're understanding and tracking the economic trends in our state. We're looking at budget projections, projected fund balances, and where we have an over-reliance on oil and gas or versus GRT, that's our state sales tax, and looking into future years as to, you know, how much revenue are we going to be able to be expecting from the GRT, from oil and gas revenue. So a reason why we're able to make such an ambitious ask was because we knew it was possible through ARPA funding. Our executive, our governor, really threw their weight behind a huge expansion and investment in early childhood with the ARPA funding, getting us up to 400% eligibility, eliminating co-pays, increasing provider rates and provider wages. And so our ask was, you know what? When that money expires, we have these two permanent funds now. We have general fund budget surpluses. Let's have a seamless continuation of those policies using state funding and using those dedicated funding sources, right? So we knew there was enough money with the trust fund and the land grant permanent fund, but we also knew what was going on with the general fund, right? And that speaks to what Whitney was talking about. How do you track and monitor those numbers, those projections throughout the year, not just when the budgets drop, but way before, so you know where are the negotiating lines going to be between the legislature and the executive. And we knew we wanted to keep what we got through ARPA, so that was our ask. And we even asked for more, right? We asked for a wage and career ladder that would bring wage parity and wage equity to those who are providing care for our youngest children, and those particularly who come from communities of color, right? And should be incentivized, particularly if they're bilingual, if they're working in tribal areas. And I want to emphasize again that this work would not have been as powerful. The effectiveness, the success of this would not have been so great if it had not been for the grassroots groups that we were able to bolster and build their capacity and build their sort of vocabulary and fluency and comfort with being in tax committees, being in the finance committee, and understanding how the budget works. So we had workers, parents, children showing up to legislative finance committees where that had not happened before. They were packing the room, and those members of those committees were like, we didn't realize so many New Mexicans were interested in the budget process, in tax policy, right? But mobilizing that power, getting those folks there and comfortable talking about why the conversation about revenue should include community voices, voices of color, of communities of color, in those rooms where traditionally they have just made budget decisions without members of the community being there. So I really want to emphasize that was really kind of the secret sauce. It's not just sort of the budget expertise, but it's the work through coalition that really enabled this to happen and enabled our state to say, like, okay, now we take these for granted now. The 400% eligibility, that's our baseline, right? The expansion of universal childcare and a constitutional right to childcare and education is our baseline, right? Now we're going to be asking for more, knowing where the money comes from and knowing that we have the money and how long we can expect to have that revenue, right? For something like the wage and career ladder. So I think that the case in New Mexico is just a really good example of what everything that Whitney talked about put into practice, and really would love to be available for any questions at the end that folks might have.
Thank you so much, Jacob. And as Jacob just said, he's going to stick around and hang out with us for a bit to the end for question and answer. We appreciate that. Very valuable to hear from your experience firsthand of navigating the process. Up next, excited to introduce Aaliyah Simmons from our partners at the Children's Funding Project. Aaliyah is the Senior Policy Associate supporting the building of fiscal maps and providing technical assistance and training to facilitate the effective use of fiscal data. So glad to have you with us, Aaliyah. And what I'll say just before you take over is that please continue to post your questions in the chat. Again, we are going to have a panel question answer towards the end after all of our presenters are presented. Aaliyah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joshua, and thank you, Whitney and Jacob, for your presentations. Hello, everyone. My name is Aaliyah Simons, and I'm a Senior Policy Associate at the Children's Funding Project. In my previous roles, I also used to be both an advocate and a policymaker in New York State for children and youth programs, particularly childcare, child welfare, and home visiting. Children's Funding Project was formed about 6 years ago to laser focus on the money, particularly the public money going towards children and youth, cradle to career. We work with states, communities, and Native nations to look at their goals and priorities for kids, add a price tag to those goals, and identify ways to cover the costs. We call this process strategic public financing, which is answering three main questions. One, what are we currently investing in our goals? Two, how much funding do we need to fund our goals in full? And three, how do we fill the gap between what we have and what we need? When advocates have done this fiscal homework and are equipped with the answers to these questions, they can make sharper requests. Today, I'm going to focus on answering that first question. What are we currently investing in our goals through fiscal mapping? Next slide, please. What is a fiscal map? A fiscal map is a visual analysis of funding streams that finance and support children and youth services and programs. This can include public funding such as state, federal, and local dollars, and private funding that mainly encompasses philanthropy dollars. The main question a fiscal map is answering is who invests how much funding into children and youth programs. Next slide. Why create a fiscal map? A fiscal map can give a clear picture of what states and localities are currently investing for children and youth, align current resources with any particular goal you may have, coordinate supports and services, can help maximize current funding opportunities, including expanding access and eligibility, and identify new areas for attention, efficiency, and innovation. A fiscal map can show gaps in funding for areas that receive little focus or were not known about. So I'm going to share my screen to show you how to use a fiscal map. So this is a fiscal map we did for the state of Alaska as part of wave 1 of our fiscal mapping partnership, which includes 14 states. Our fiscal maps are Power BI reports tracking funding for children and youth ages 0 to 24. These maps are uploaded onto our website that you can access through our National Trends Analysis link that will be shared in the chat later. This first page is our table of contents page with buttons where you can click on any button and it will lead you to every single page in the map. So I will click on the services page, and on the services page, it lists all the services that a state funds within our year of scope. So the year of scope we were looking at for Alaska was fiscal years 2019 to 2021. So I unclick select all. So for example, if I want to see how much Alaska funds for ECE slots, so early childhood education slots, if you go to the chart on the bottom, it'll show the name of the funding stream, funding description, the funding level, so whether it's state, federal, COVID-19 relief dollars, service and program category, and then each appropriation for each fiscal year of our scope. And you can also scroll down to see all the funding streams that were available for these fiscal years. I unclick this service, so I will click another service, so home visiting. So the funding streams will change to maps of funding streams that support home visiting in Alaska. So the services page is useful in understanding the different funding streams available and what services and programs they support. We find advocates and providers tend to think of services and programs first, then funding stream, while budget holders and policymakers think of funding streams
What are you talking about?
first,
I'm
then programs. The services page brings these two concepts together to make it easy for all users to find what funding streams support a particular service and what services are being supported by a particular funding stream. The next page I will show is the budget comparison page, which is towards the end of the fiscal map. So on this page, for each fiscal year of our scope, we compare the percentage of funding dedicated for children and youth programs in relation to Alaska's total general fund dollars. On the right, we also do a per capita estimate for each fiscal year. In the pie chart on the bottom towards the right, what we do is we make a pie chart where we take out K through 12 public education. So we show how much Alaska is funded for all other children and youth programs outside of K through 12 education, since that program receives a lot of funding and it inflates the total investments for children and youth. So the purpose of this page is to show how much is being spent for children in relation to how much the state spends for other programs, so we can get a clear understanding of how a state specifically invests for children and youth. So we do not include on this page federal funding or COVID-19 relief funding. So in the national analysis trends link that will be shared later, on the first page, if you scroll down, it will show for every state in wave one, it'll show how much they received in state, federal, and COVID-19 relief fundings, and they are stacked right next to each other, so you can compare to see how much they receive for each funding source and how they compare to one another. So I'm going to stop my share and go back to the slides. So this all fits in with the goal of strategic public financing planning. We're looking to answer the three questions that I listed before. How much money are we currently investing in our strategic priorities for children and youth, which a fiscal map can answer? The second question, what will it cost to fund new or underfunded priorities? What will it cost to scale currently funded priorities, which we do through cost estimation and cost modeling? And then the last question, what revenue streams can we use to pay for identified costs? And we can do that by advocating for new revenue funding sources, as well as utilizing existing funding streams to better support children and youth, since many states and federal programs can be used for more than one service. So if anyone is interested in working with us for our state and local fiscal mapping partnership, cost modeling, and sourcing additional revenue, you can reach out to our partnership manager, Allie Farrell, who is also on this webinar, and I'll put her contact information in the chat later. Thank you all for listening, and I will pass it back to Joshua.
Sorry about that technical difficulty. Thank you so much, Aaliyah. We appreciate that. And Aaliyah will also be hanging out with us to the end to take questions and answers. And of course, the Children's Funding Project is available to NCIT members to support with financial mapping. Several of the speakers have reminded us that it's important for us to lean into our partners and the coalition members' strengths to fill the gaps that we may have in our organizations, to make our organizations and ultimately our movement stronger. And I'm excited to introduce the final speaker. Dustin Holfinger is the State Government Relations Director at the American Heart Association. Dustin has on-the-ground experience navigating the budgeting and appropriations process as an advocate who has run appropriations advocacy campaigns. Thank you so much for joining us, Dustin. Are you there? There you go.
I am here. Yeah, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Can you hear me, Josh? Great. Yeah,
Yes.
so thank you everybody for the opportunity. I'm Dustin Holfinger at the American Heart Association, and like many other public health organizations, the American Heart Association has many policy objectives, ranging from tobacco control to CPR in schools to complete streets. But the one that I want to discuss a little bit today is our work to create or expand SNAP healthy food incentive programs through local or state government support. So in Ohio, we are a 2-year legislative session, year round. So we're technically coming up on the end of our 134th General Assembly right now, 135th General Assembly right now. That will end in December. And then the governor will we'll have an incumbent governor that has to introduce his upcoming budget in the next cycle by January 15th. A newly elected governor would have to release that budget process or they're as introduced by March 15th. So back in 2020, October of 2020, I was approached by Produce Perks in the state of Ohio. And Produce Perks is our SNAP double up program. So you get a 1-to-1 match for all SNAP participants to purchase fresh fruits and vegetables from Ohio farmers, farmers markets, and small business retailers. These dollars are not a foregone conclusion in our operating budget and will not be included. We knew they would not be included in the governor's as introduced version. So we would need to find a champion that would be willing to put that forward as an amendment. So in the fiscal year 2020/21 state operating budget, they initially approved it for $250,000 per fiscal year to expand those services to provide those healthy food purchases. But they were under the TANF eligible households. And as a result, Produce Perks was able to support over $1 million in healthy food purchases by SNAP participants in 2020. These dollars go back into our communities, stimulating local economies and strengthening our local food system and empowering low-income consumers to buy that healthy food for their families, providing a dignity of choice for SNAP-eligible families that have been most seriously impacted by the pandemic and other socioeconomic reasons. The program officials at Produce Perks were seeking to double that amount of the program, hoping to secure $500,000 in that operating budget per year. Seeing that we had a few months before the governor was to release his version, we decided to at least reach out to them and to the Department of Job and Family Services to request their support in case we were able to get that included in the House version of the operating budget and find that champion that we so desperately needed. So as we went through the legislative process for the campaign, the House was surprisingly supportive right off the bat. It was we held a few legislative meetings, and I think every person we spoke with said, "Yeah, we'll champion that for you." Well, we only need one to put forward the amendment, but we did appreciate obviously the support of everybody that was willing to provide it. So the Senate was a little bit of a harder lift because sometimes in Ohio, unfortunately, the budget will go from the House to the Senate, and everything pretty much gets zeroed out. So we had to really kind of start that process, that lobbying and advocacy process all over again in the upper chamber. Fortunately for us, though, we had Senate Finance Committee Chairman who understood the importance and felt it was imperative to include this in their version of the operating budget also. To continue that pressure, not just on his office, we didn't want him to carry all the burden in caucus, but we relied on our volunteers to make phone calls and send emails to legislators across the state, really kind of signifying why this is important to them, why it's important to the community. We also called on the Grocers Association and others within the farming community to discuss that too. Ultimately, we were successful in obtaining an increased amount for that budget bill, or for that budget. So we landed the last cycle at 2 cycles ago at 500,000. So I mentioned earlier that we have a 2-year budget cycle. Every 2 years, obviously, comes back around again for appropriations. And then again, in late 2022, we started this process all over again. Every odd numbered year is a budget cycle year, if you can guess. So Produce Perks reached out again and said, "Hey, would you guys be interested in partnering with us again for another doubling of this program to expand their market, to allow more communities and more farmers markets the ability to get this $1-to-$1 match for fresh fruits and vegetables up to $25. This time we were not able to get the increase or anything in the ads introduced, as I mentioned earlier, because these are TANF dollars and they're wiped out. But we did hit the ground running with a 6 policy push in this operating budget bill. So the Produce Perks was just one of 6 opportunities that we had in this bill to affect some changes. Getting the administration's support initially was vital to the support in the legislature and having them kind of advocate from behind the scenes, essentially. So our meetings again with legislators started in early November of 2022 with those that we knew were coming back into the next General Assembly. for that bill that would be introduced in January 2023. This process was actually a little bit easier than the first because most members had remembered exactly what we were asking for the last time around. So continuity and consistency breeds continuity and consistency within the legislature as well. So the more you're asking for it, the more you educate them, hopefully the more they remember it, are willing to continue to fight for funding. So this time around, we were also looking to double it again, going from $500,000 a year to $1 million a year. And we were a little apprehensive. We didn't think that adding that extra comma in there would really kind of rise to the top of this legislature's priority. But fortunately in the House, it was inserted. And again, in the Senate, it was removed. But again, thankfully, that same chairman from the Senate Finance Committee was there that was willing to champion this request on our behalf. And it's because of him and our volunteers' unwavering support to fight this food insecurity in Ohio that we were facing, that we were successful again in obtaining the doubling of that TANF appropriation. So as we are looking to the end of this calendar year, we'll be seeking again another doubling of this, but fortunately, we're going to actually try to find a way to get these out of TANF dollars and find a more permanent funding solution for this important program. So really, I would recommend that if you're seeking appropriations, start early. Find a way to explain why the increase or why the appropriation at all is important to the state of your state, in my case, state of Ohio, and really kind of lean on your volunteers and find other organizations that are willing to help champion this your initiative for you and with you. So as we enter the latter part of 2024, we'll be beginning those conversations probably in October and November again for a new legislative cycle coming up in January of 2025. So I would be very brief there, but wish us luck in that venture, and we'll be around to answer any other questions that you may have. And I'll turn it back to Josh.
Thank you so much, Dustin. And thank again to each one of our speakers for participating and sharing this valuable information for our advocates who are on the ground, doing the work, trying to figure out how do we create change through these appropriations campaigns. This is invaluable information. So now we're going to get to the good part. We are going to move forward with our question and answer portion. And so at this time, we're going to open up the floor for questions from NCIT members to ask questions of our panelists. Feel free again to put it in the chat or use the raise your hand function, and we will acknowledge you and ask you to come off mute and able to ask your question. So while folks get acclimated and prepare their questions and raise their hands, I'll kind of start off the conversation with a question. Came through after the launch of the Appropriations Advocacy Toolkit. How should you adjust your approach to determining your budget ask when your state is experiencing a budget shortfall versus when it's experiencing a budget surplus? Are there specific strategies or considerations to keep in mind in each scenario? And I will put that to our panelists. Anyone can feel free to chime in on that question.
I don't know who else might want to speak, specifically to adjusting the ask, since I wasn't, the focus of my presentation, but I will say that I think the first question is to examine for yourself whether the state's proposed budget shortfall or surplus is real, right? So look into the budget materials for yourself and determine whether that is propaganda, honestly, because a lot of the time state legislators will say, we are projecting a shortfall, and what they mean is that we are expecting to see lower income tax revenue, or that we are, expecting that we won't be growing revenue this year. And it's actually the case that they have very high rainy day funds, right? Or that they have passed a recent tax cut that has caused that shortfall. Right. And so then your ask might not actually need to be lessened. You might just need to change the way that you were talking about it and to talk about whose needs are being put forward and prioritized in your states. If it's, the families that rely on the programs and services that you're trying to fund, or if it's people who might have benefited from recent tax cuts, or people who might be benefiting from changes to the property tax structure, things like that.
Thank you so much for that, Whitney. Anyone else want to add or chime in? All right.
I think Whitney hit the nail on the head with that one. I think just do your own research and find a way to really kind of make it resonate with legislators, because programs like the SNAP incentive program, even with a budget shortfall, I think we still would have been successful just because of the messaging that came along with it, and finding a way to incorporate that within there.
Honestly, if you don't take anything else from at least my portion of this presentation, but I think the other presenters would agree with me on this, it's that there is enough for everyone, right? States have a lot of money. There are a lot of people with a lot of money and a lot of held wealth in this country overall. And it is just about the way that we are tapping into that. It is not that there's not enough to go around.
That's a really good point to make. Thank you so much for that. Here's another question that came from the chat. This one is specifically to Jacob from Allison Logan. You mentioned some funds when you were in the case study, and she's asking, are those funds strictly for early childhood education or open to early childhood health and development?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Early Childhood Trust Fund was set up in 2020. That specifically is for, it sort of goes into a program fund for our early childhood care and education department. What is defined as early childhood, I think is something that advocates and policymakers are sort of always in negotiation with. But I think when it comes to the fiscal side of things, we really wanted to protect the statutory language to say that fund could only go to the early childhood department, just for the precedent that it would set, that in future years, if there are really slim budget years, we would not want the legislature to have sort of an open window to open that fund up. That said, there is freedom within the appropriations process for the agency to do interagency transfers. And so she actually, the secretary did do interagency transfers of a few million for infant, toddler mental health, behavioral health programs, things that were, what we would say are part of the holistic sort of prenatal to 5 spectrum, but might be more under the purview of different departments like the Department of Health. So that's totally reasonable. I think that, for us, it was more just like the precedent that it would set for the legislature to have the power to take those funds away from what they were designated for in statute.
Thank you so much. And I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to go to one more question because we still have a survey for you all who are in attendance. So we'll make this the final question, and it is for the entire group. What are some of the most successful and effective strategies for advocates to use when major budget decisions are made entirely behind closed doors? This makes it difficult, next to impossible, to know what discussions were among lawmakers and why certain decisions were made, related to the transparency conversation from earlier. Anyone want to chime in there?
Yeah, I'll go first on this one. Again, with our champion, find someone you can trust, that is going to speak up for you in caucus, and have their cell phone number, and make sure they have your cell phone number, because then they can ask you questions on the details and provide that championing in those conversations behind the scenes, really on your behalf. And I know that occurred with ours because I got multiple messages. Hey, how much are you asking for again? What was this going towards? How much is this going to be able to expand? And then they can use all those answers in caucus. So really got to find some people or legislators that you can lean on and trust in those crazy times that we call budget season.
Thank you so much for that. Anyone else want to add to that?
Go ahead, Amelia.
Just get in as early as possible. Don't wait. If you have an idea, let people know, stay on top of it. Because if you wait until the budget comes out, sometimes it's just a little bit too late. So always kind of like aim high, and if you get in early, that's actually like pretty effective.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Whitney.
I just want to add that even if you fail to get your priorities included into the budget, that it could be a really good strategy to call attention to the fact that part of the reason you couldn't was because the budget was passed with very little input from citizens, or very quickly, or with just a handful of lawmakers being the decision makers there. You can talk to reporters about that. You can put that out in your blogs and in your, reports, and say it to people when you go out into community meetings, because I think there is a lack of transparency about budget processes overall, and people don't often know that that isn't supposed to be the norm, right? And so calling attention to the process, even when it doesn't work for you, is a way to make change that you can build on in the next legislative session, and kind of honestly shame lawmakers into the behavior that we actually want to see for a really healthy democracy.
Thank you so much for that, Whitney. And to those who are in the audience, you all will see right before you a brief survey of today's workshop. If you can take a moment to fill that out before you leave. And in closing, one of the things that I'll add to, and to say this, that Dustin kind of touched on, Whitney, is that it's a reminder to start building relationships before the legislative session. On the state level, your legislators are very accessible. You can reach them, and like Dustin said, you want to be able to have someone's cell phone number and identify who that advocate is and be able to text them and answer questions sometimes while they're on the floor. And that only happens from having the relationship in advance. So take advantage of those opportunities that they're that close to you. It's not like members of Congress who are a little bit more removed. You can reach out and touch the state legislator. And so utilize that to your advantage. That can be extremely helpful. So again, thank you so much, Aaliyah, Whitney, Jacob, and Dustin. We appreciate you all for joining us and bringing your expertise to this workshop today. Thank you for everyone who's attended today. Thank you to those who stuck around. I know we ran a few minutes over. We truly appreciate you. We'll make sure that you all get resources and follow up in an email from today's workshop. So everyone have a great afternoon.